Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the veil, literally and metaphorically, on one of history's most misunderstood rituals, the medieval wedding. You might imagine flower crowns, candlelit chapels, maybe a slow medieval lute ballad in the background. But no. Think dirt floors, livestock negotiations, and a whole lot of awkward silence between two kids who just met. You probably won't survive this wedding. Not because of the ceremony, but because everything leading up to it, and everything that came after, was a minefield of politics, puberty, and property rights. Romance didn't just take a back seat, it was tied up in the cart and left behind in a ditch. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start with something weird. For most people in the medieval world, the wedding day itself? It wasn't even the main event. If anything, it was a bureaucratic afterthought, or a socially expected formality. The real action was in the negotiations that came before it. Because marriage wasn't a love story, it was an economic transaction. A merger. A land deal with better costumes. Families would hammer out the terms of a union long before the bride and groom ever made eye contact. If they ever made eye contact. In noble families, this often started when the children were babies. Literal infants were betrothed, which just meant their parents decided they'd get married one day, pending political climate, plagues, and whether one of them caught dysentery first. These early agreements were called pre-contracts, and they were basically prenups on steroids. In some places, if a pre-contract was broken without the church's say-so, it could nullify a future marriage, because the church saw promises as spiritually binding, even if the couple was still in diapers when it was made. And yes, this also applied to peasants. You didn't need a castle and a coat of arms to be trapped in a strategically convenient marriage. If you had a pig, a patch of land, or a daughter, you had something to bargain with. Most families weren't thinking about cake flavors or guest lists. They were asking the real questions. How much land will we gain? Will the dowry include that goat? Can we get that field near the river? This wasn't a quirky side note, it was the point of the entire ritual. Marriage was how land stayed in the family, how alliances were secured, and how peace, or war, was made between rival households. The church tried to moralize it later, but for a good chunk of medieval history, marriage was less about divine union and more about how many oxen you could score in the deal. Oh, and you didn't need to wait for the church, either. Before official rules solidified, a marriage could be made with just a mutual verbal agreement. No priest, no paperwork, no witnesses. Just two people saying, "I take you," with the right intention. Boom. Married. This led to a ton of drama later on when people started pretending they'd never said the magic words. No, I didn't say I take you as wife, I said I like your knife. Big difference. And if you're thinking, well, at least the ceremony was pretty, sorry again. Most medieval weddings were kinda boring. For nobles, they were elaborate but grim affairs. Think tight seating, long Latin prayers, and everyone sweating under 20 layers of wool. For peasants, the wedding might just happen at the church door, with a few friends and a priest mumbling through the ceremony like he was late for lunch. There weren't always rings, or veils, or bouquets. Sometimes, the bride wore her best dress, sometimes, that meant her only dress. And sometimes, the ceremony happened on a feast day purely because everyone was already gathered. So hey, might as well get hitched between the pig roast and the prayer. Even when weddings were celebrated, the emphasis wasn't on the couple, it was on the alliance. Guests weren't there for love, they were there for business. Or gossip. Or to make sure the bride actually brought that goose she promised. In short, the medieval wedding was less dream day and more socially required checkpoint. It marked the beginning of a partnership that had more to do with fields and inheritance than candlelight dinners. And if you think that sounds cold, congrats, you're feeling exactly the way a medieval bride probably did. But don't worry, the romance gets worse. Because in the next chapter, we're going to talk about how little say you actually had in the matter. So, you've just found out you're getting married. Congratulations. Except, you didn't choose this person. You probably don't even know them. You might be 12. And if you're lucky, you'll get to meet your spouse before the wedding, not during the bedding ceremony. Maybe. In the medieval world, the idea of choosing your own partner was as foreign as indoor plumbing. Love matches? Cute in stories, disastrous in real life. Because marriage wasn't about you, it was about your family, your lineage, your land, and sometimes a political grudge that went back 3 generations. If you were born noble, your marriage was a chess move. Kings and lords didn't marry for affection. They married to gain territory, form alliances, or seal peace treaties. Your father might offer you to the enemy just to keep them from raiding the village next spring. Romantic, right? Even among peasants, where the stakes were lower, the system was the same. Your parents picked your spouse based on what the marriage would bring to the household. Another strong back, a dowry cow, a piece of land, or even just a neighbor with good harvests and fewer lice than usual. And if you were a woman, your chances of saying no to a match? Slim to none. In many regions, the phrase giving a daughter in marriage was literal. She was handed over, like property, by her father or male guardian. Consent laws technically existed, but they were more like guidelines. A girl could theoretically refuse, but who was going to listen? The priest. He was probably the one officiating the wedding with a wink and a side bet on how long the marriage would last. Now let's talk age. Brace yourself. Girls were often married off startlingly young. Like, alarming levels of young. Canon law set the minimum marriage age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. And those weren't just guidelines, they were enforced. Sometimes even earlier matches were arranged, with consummation delayed until puberty. Supposedly, the idea was that once a girl could bear children, she was ready to be a wife. Whether or not she could spell her husband's name. Not important. Whether she could survive childbirth at that age. Also not important. Apparently. The church occasionally preached against child marriages, but often turned a blind eye, especially when land or power was involved. Imagine being 12, and instead of doodling in the dirt with your friends, you're sent to a neighboring village to marry a guy named Ulrich who smells like pickled fish and is 20 years older than you. No, you don't love him. Yes, you'll still be expected to cook, clean, and start having babies as soon as possible. Bonus points if you survive childbirth before you're 15. And don't think this was just a noble thing. Poor families did it too, because marrying off a daughter early meant one less mouth to feed. Sometimes it was even seen as a gift to be given a husband with a steady income and a house with a roof that only leaks on one side. And if your parents wanted to marry you off and you somehow protested, ran away, refused to say the vows, hid in a convent, well, tough. There were ways around that. Some families used force. Others just arranged a private ceremony and claimed you said yes. In some places, your silence was interpreted as consent. Literally. If you didn't scream no, they assumed you were good with it. Even boys didn't always get a say. Especially noble boys, who could be married off at 14 to girls half their size and expected to start producing heirs like they were plowing a field. Imagine being a teenager and suddenly responsible for a household, a wife, and a vassal or two. No pressure. It's worth noting that this wasn't just some medieval quirk, it was deeply ingrained in law, religion, and culture. Parents saw it as their duty to arrange good matches. Marriage was the foundation of society, after all. Better to lock in a deal early than let your kid make some disastrous love match with a pig farmer's son. But let's say, by some miracle, you did fall in love. You found someone you liked. You wanted to marry them. You were willing to defy your family, maybe even the church. What then? You'd better hope you had powerful allies. Or a good lawyer. Or a very fast horse. Because forbidden love in the Middle Ages didn't end in a romantic elopement and a cute cottage by the woods. It usually ended in annulment, disinheritance, social exile, or in some cases, if you were noble, execution. Especially if you were a woman. Extra especially if you were a royal woman. The double standards were absolutely Olympic level. So no, you didn't get to swipe right on your future spouse. You didn't go on dates, fall in love, and pick out matching tunics. You were told, this is your husband, and expected to smile while they paraded you around like part of a real estate transaction. And that's just the beginning. In the next section, we're going to dig into something even more uncomfortable. The fact that girls were married off before they were old enough to spell the word marriage. Alright. Time to talk about the part of medieval marriage that tends to make modern stomachs turn, child brides. And no, we're not using child loosely here. We're talking pre-teens. Sometimes toddlers. Yes, toddlers. By today's standards, it's horrifying. But back then, it was disturbingly routine. In medieval Europe, marrying off girls at 12 or younger was not just legal, it was widely practiced and, in many cases, expected. The logic? Simple. A girl was considered marriage ready once she could bear children. Her body might not be done growing. Her brain definitely wasn't. But if she got her first period, congratulations. She was now eligible to become someone's wife. Or, more accurately, someone's legal reproductive partner and household laborer. Canon law, aka the church's rules, set the marriage age at 12 for girls and 14 for boys. And while that sounds awful, many families didn't even wait for that. Kids could be betrothed from the cradle, with the consummation part scheduled for later. Supposedly. That later part was often more suggestion than rule. Now, let's be very clear, there was a difference, at least in theory, between marriage and consummation. The church insisted that consummation shouldn't happen until the girl reached puberty. But what puberty looked like to a 35-year-old lord with an estate to pass on and an heir to make? That's where the line got blurry. Or flat out ignored. It wasn't just a local village problem either. This happened all across Europe. Kings, dukes, merchants, and even priests all participated in this system. Take Isabella of Valois, married to King Richard II of England. She was 6 years old. 6. They waited a few years before consummating the marriage, but the political alliance was in full swing before she could read. And this wasn't rare, it was strategic. Marrying young locked in political deals before circumstances could change. If you waited too long, the other party might die of plague, or get excommunicated, or change their mind and marry someone wealthier. Best to seal the deal early. Morals were secondary. It's important to understand, these weren't isolated gross old man marries child stories. This was the system. Girls were seen as family assets, like land, livestock, or titles. And the earlier they were used in marriage negotiations, the more value they had. It was a twisted kind of market logic. Younger meant more reproductive years, which meant more heirs, which meant more power. And yes, it's awful. But it's also historically accurate. In medieval logic, your daughter was kind of like an investment property. And the return on investment, political leverage, social mobility, and maybe, some cows. You'd think the church might have stepped in more aggressively, but they were often complicit. Clergy would officiate these marriages, bless them, and even defend them when challenged. Sure, there were occasional papal outcries about inappropriate unions, but those were usually aimed at political enemies, not child welfare. Now, if you're wondering what the girls thought about all this, well, they didn't get to write the chronicles. Most of what we know comes from legal records, letters, and court documents, all written by men. But from the few scattered references we do have, we know that some girls tried to run away, or fled to convents, or begged for their marriages to be annulled. Spoiler: it rarely worked. Once a girl was married, her body and labor belonged to her husband. And remember, she was still expected to run a household. She might be 13, but she had to cook, clean, spin wool, churn butter, tend chickens, and, most terrifying of all, bear children. Childbirth was brutal for adult women. For girls, it could be a death sentence. In fact, maternal mortality rates in the Middle Ages were horrifying across the board, but they skyrocketed for very young mothers. Their pelvises weren't fully developed. They lacked the strength, the nutrition, and the medical knowledge to survive childbirth, let alone raise children. A girl might marry at 12, get pregnant at 13, and die in labor at 14. And society would shrug. If she did survive, well, she'd probably go on to have 10, 12, even 15 pregnancies. That was the expectation. No contraception, no family planning, just babies, babies, babies until your body gave out. Or the plague took you. whichever came first. And yet, somehow, this was all considered normal. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't whispered about. This was how society functioned. Entire generations were born from children who hadn't even had time to grow up. To make it even worse, if a girl wasn't married by the time she hit her teens, she started to be seen as a burden. An unmarried daughter meant extra mouths to feed, potential shame for the family, and zero political gain. So the pressure was constant. Get married early. Produce heirs quickly. Die quietly. That's why the few women who managed to avoid this system, by joining a convent or living under wealthy guardianship, were statistical outliers. They weren't rebels. They were just lucky. And let's be real, this wasn't just a thing that happened. This was a foundational part of medieval life. It shaped family structures, politics, economies, and even wars. All built on the backs of girls who never got to be girls. But the church still liked to think it was in charge. So in the next section, we're diving into the ecclesiastical chaos that was early marriage law, when weddings could happen in barns, beds, or back alleys, and nobody quite knew the rules. So, who was actually in charge of all this marriage madness? You might assume the church had everything tightly under control. Clear rules, solemn ceremonies, long robes, a big Latin stamp of approval. Wrong. For centuries, medieval marriage law was less God-ordained clarity and more DIY legal nightmare. There were official doctrines, sure, but they were enforced inconsistently, interpreted wildly, and updated roughly as often as your local tavern changed the beer barrel. Here's the wild part. For much of the medieval period, you didn't even need a priest to get married. Yep. Two people could just say they were married, and if they both meant it, then poof. That counted. The magic words were something like, "I take you as my husband," or "I take you as my wife." Say it in front of witnesses. Married. Say it without witnesses. Still married. Say it under a tree, on a cart, in a random wheat field, or at the local market stall where you're buying turnips. All good. That wasn't just some village superstition either. This was canon law, and it stood for centuries. The church was actually pretty slow to formalize wedding rituals. Until the 12th century, they were still debating whether mutual consent alone, spoken, not written, was enough to form a valid union. And in practice, this led to absolute chaos. People would whisper vows in private and then ghost each other. Others would claim they were tricked into marriage because someone said the words in jest. One guy married a woman by accident because he said, "I wish you were my wife," during a flirtatious conversation, and then had to get an annulment because, legally, he wasn't joking hard enough. At one point, it got so messy that the church tried to tighten things up. The big change came in 1215, at the Fourth Lateran Council. That's when the church said, "Okay, new rule, marriages should at least be announced in church before they happen." Not exactly revolutionary, but it was a start. Even then, it took centuries for the full wedding ceremony as we know it to become the standard. Priests weren't even required to be present until much later. The church liked having a say, but people were stubborn. If a couple wanted to get married in a barn by a ditch, who was going to stop them? And the loopholes? Chef's kiss. There were at least 4 different categories of consent. You could have present consent, "I take you now," future consent, "I will take you later," and both of those had a mess of sub-rules. Did you say it while sober? Did anyone hear it? Did you say it with intent? Or were you just trying to get out of paying for ale? The church eventually had to start asking newlyweds, "Did anyone force you? Did you understand the words? Did you both say them out loud and with intent to marry?" It was like a medieval version of an awkward HR meeting. And let's not forget about clandestine marriages, the medieval equivalent of Vegas elopements. These were private, unofficial unions where two people just said the vows in secret, without family or church involvement. Sometimes they were romantic. Sometimes they were desperate. Sometimes they were just a way to dodge a political engagement you didn't want. The church hated these. Parents hated these. But the law still recognized them. That meant if you got secretly married, then tried to marry someone else later, surprise, you just committed bigamy. Congratulations. Hope you enjoy public penance and ecclesiastical court. Some towns started setting up official marriage registers or required bans, public announcements of upcoming marriages, just to cut down on all the he said she said drama. But even then, enforcement varied wildly depending on local customs, clerical literacy, and how much ale your witnesses had consumed. Also, side note, priests themselves weren't always following the rules. Many of them were married, or secretly cohabiting with a housekeeper, which added another juicy layer of irony when they tried to enforce celibacy and moral behavior on everyone else. One of the best examples of medieval marital weirdness comes from the 14th century. A man and woman hold hands over a garden gate, exchange vows, and then go their separate ways. 10 years later, one of them claims the marriage was legit and wants to enforce it. Cue legal battle. The court agrees. That gateside conversation? Valid marriage. Try explaining that to your in-laws. And don't even get started on what constituted invalid marriages. You could get annulled for being too closely related, spoiler, everyone was related, or for not having full consent, which no one could prove, or because the ceremony happened on a day when saints frowned on romance. If it was Lent, Advent, or literally any major feast day, it was frowned upon to marry, which was most of the calendar. The takeaway here: marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't some sacred, orderly ritual. It was more like a tangled mess of verbal contracts, inconsistent church interference, and couples winging it with varying degrees of regret. So the next time someone says marriage used to be sacred, just remember, for hundreds of years, you could technically marry someone by whispering sweet nothings near a cow pen. Next up, we're diving into the economics of the whole thing, because nothing says happily ever after like selling your daughter for 3 goats and a pile of grain. Alright, enough about vows and barnyard ceremonies. Let's talk money. Or more specifically, livestock, grain, linens, and whatever else counted as currency when your local bank was a guy named Walter with a wooden chest and a drinking problem. Because medieval marriage? It wasn't free. In fact, getting married was one of the most financially significant transactions of your life. Forget love or compatibility, the key question was, what's the bride worth? And by worth, we mean in literal sheep, acres, or sacks of oats. Enter the dowry. If you were a bride, your family had to pay up, often painfully, for someone else to take you off their hands. Think of it as a starter pack. Here's some land, a chest of linens, maybe a spinning wheel and a goat, and now please marry our daughter before she turns 14 and becomes old. This wasn't just a peasant thing. Even among nobles, dowries were essential. A poor dowry could tank your marriage prospects faster than the bubonic plague. For noble women, the dowry was often land, castles, or entire villages. Your family could go bankrupt marrying you off. But hey, if it secured an alliance or got you into the royal bloodline lottery, it was worth it. Of course, the opposite also existed. Enter the bride price, where the groom's family paid for the bride. This happened more in early and rural societies, and it treated the woman more explicitly as a transfer of property. It was like buying a new plow, expensive, but essential if you wanted a good harvest. Of children. Confused? Good. Because it got even messier. In some regions, families tried to combine the dowry and bride price into one complex transaction, involving land leases, future promises, and livestock trade. Medieval lawyers had to get involved, scribbling notes in bad Latin about how many chickens equaled a vineyard. You'd think the bride would get to keep some of this wealth, right? Ha! The dowry might have technically belonged to her, but control almost always passed to the husband. It became part of the household assets. He could use it, spend it, lose it gambling, whatever. If he died, sometimes she got it back. But only if his family didn't contest it first. And trust me, they would. And don't forget the mourning gift. Sounds sweet, right? This was something the groom gave the bride after the wedding night, as a reward for her virginity. Usually land or money, if she was lucky. But if she wasn't a virgin, no gift. Or a smaller one. Or public shame. It was less gesture of love and more receipt of purchase. Some regions even had traditions where the bride had to present proof of virginity. A bloody sheet, a witness testimony, or just, good vibes. No pressure. Now here's where things get even more cringe. In some poorer communities, Families rented out their daughters as temporary wives or concubines before arranging a real marriage. This wasn't seen as scandalous, just economically practical. If your daughter could earn a few coins as a nobleman's mistress before settling down, well, that was a win. For you, not for her. And remember, women had zero economic independence. Once married, they couldn't own property in their own right unless they were widowed. Everything went to the husband. If she brought in 10 sheep, he decided where they grazed, who they were sold to, and whether they were traded for booze. It wasn't just romantic disempowerment, it was full-on financial erasure. But wait, it gets pettier. Sometimes, a wedding would fall through at the last second. Maybe one family changed their mind. Maybe the groom got cold feet. Or maybe someone died. In that case, get ready for dowry refund lawsuits. Entire medieval court systems were clogged with bitter parents trying to reclaim goats, candelabras, or 6 bolts of wool they'd sent with their daughter. And if the wedding did go through, but the couple later split or one of them died, the dowry became a matter of hot debate. Did it stay with the husband's family? Go back to the bride's relatives? Was there a clause about it being returned only if no heirs were produced? Medieval prenuptial agreements could be shockingly specific, like, you get the pig only if the marriage lasts more than 3 harvests and produces at least 1 male child. Now, some noblewomen were smart. They'd hide portions of their dowries. Secret coins sewn into hems. Jewelry tucked into undergarments. Little emergency funds in case their husband turned out to be a violent drunk, or the marriage collapsed faster than a wooden bridge during flood season. But for the average woman, there was no escape. She was traded, married off, stripped of her financial identity, and expected to serve quietly, and be grateful. The wealth exchanged around her wedding wasn't hers to control. It was her price tag. So next time someone says marriage is priceless, just remember, in medieval Europe, your value was measured in poultry. And speaking of awkward displays, wait till we get to the part where your neighbors are invited to your wedding night. So, you've been married off, traded for livestock, stripped of autonomy, possibly 12 years old, and now it's time for the big moment. No, not your first dance. Not cutting the cake. Not even a quiet night alone with your new spouse. It's time for the public bedding ceremony. Yes, public. As in, people. Watching. Let's break this down. In many medieval cultures, especially in Europe, it wasn't enough for 2 people to exchange vows and maybe kiss awkwardly in front of a priest. Nope. The marriage wasn't truly real, legally or socially, until it was consummated. That meant sex. And in case anyone doubted it happened, witnesses were there to make sure. Imagine a room filled with your relatives, neighbors, and some of your future in-laws. Cheering, singing, maybe a little drunk, herding you and your brand new spouse toward a bed. There might be fiddlers. There might be food. Sometimes they literally threw nuts at the couple. It was half party, half peep show, all horrifying. In some cultures, they'd escort the bride and groom to the bed, strip them down, tuck them in, and then watch them kiss. Or touch each other. Or just lie there long enough to suggest they were doing the deed. The crowd would then exit, chuckling and toasting each other. In some cases, especially among nobility or royalty, people stayed longer to witness the whole process. As in, literally standing by while the couple had sex. Just to make sure it took. Why? Because if there was ever a dispute, say, someone tried to get the marriage annulled later, the question of whether the couple actually had sex could decide everything. No consummation, no marriage. That meant land, money, and political alliances could all be undone. So witnesses were an insurance policy. And if you were poor, you didn't escape it. Villagers might not watch, but they'd crowd outside the house and listen. Seriously. In many communities, it was normal for friends and neighbors to hover outside the cottage waiting to hear a grunt, a squeak, or some bedsheet rustling. Anything to confirm that little Hildegard and her new husband had sealed the deal. Sometimes people even waited to see a blood-stained sheet. A physical proof of virginity. Families would hang it out the window, parade it through the street, or display it like a trophy. If there was no blood, cue gossip, scandal, or even a refund demand. Yes, return the bride, like she was defective goods. Of course, let's talk about how absurd this is. Virginity proof through bleeding is medically junk. Not every woman bleeds the first time. But in medieval Europe, a clean sheet could destroy your life. You might be accused of fornication. You could lose your dowry. You could be sent to a convent, or worse, back to your parents with your shame in a metaphorical, and sometimes literal, sack. And that's assuming the husband didn't straight up refuse to consummate the marriage. Because here's another twist: if the man didn't perform, the woman was stuck. She couldn't file for divorce. Not easily. She could petition the church for an annulment. But first, she had to prove his impotence. You know where this is going. Enter the medieval virility test. In some cases, a court or church council would force the groom to prove he could perform, in public. With witnesses. Sometimes with medical examiners. Sometimes with clergy. There are actual court records of men being ordered to masturbate in front of officials to demonstrate that they were capable of marriage. One man, accused of being impotent, had to attempt sex with his wife in front of a priest and a group of witnesses. It didn't go well. They annulled the marriage. I don't think either of them ever emotionally recovered. And let's not forget, this entire bizarre public ritual wasn't about love. It was about property, lineage, and control. Consummation meant the wife was now legally her husband's. If heirs were born later, no one could challenge their legitimacy. The bedding was legal proof of ownership. Basically, in noble families, the bedding ceremony could be ridiculously elaborate. Fancy beds, silk sheets, groomsmen carrying torches, attendants fluffing pillows. Some royal couples were even blessed in bed by priests who stood at the foot of the mattress and chanted prayers. Yes, a literal holy bed blessing. Because nothing sets the mood like a psalm about sin. Sometimes, the ceremony became pure performance. Guests would pretend to push the bride and groom together, make jokes, or sing lewd songs. Think frat party meets marriage contract meets religious ritual. Other times, it was deadly serious. Some regions believed a non-consummated marriage offended God and could bring curses. Others thought it was just plain unlucky. Either way, it was never about you. Not your comfort. Not your feelings. And definitely not your privacy. You were an actor in a medieval drama, with an audience that wanted closure in the form of bedding. And even if you did everything right, if the groom got cold feet later, or just got bored, he could claim the marriage was never consummated and try to get it annulled. With no witnesses or bloody sheets to prove it, good luck convincing the church otherwise. So the wedding might have lasted a day, but this part? This is what people remembered. Not the dancing. Not the feast. The bedding. The moment when a girl became a wife. When the alliance became law. And when your life as a woman stopped being yours. But don't worry, we're not done yet. In the next section, we'll explore how you could be legally married and not even know it. Because in medieval Europe, even flirting could turn into a lifetime commitment. Okay, so let's say you've managed to avoid the livestock dowry, skipped the public bedding embarrassment, and never stood in front of a priest. Great. You're single, right? Not so fast. In medieval Europe, you could be married without realizing it. All it took was a few choice words, maybe some hand-holding, and bam, you're legally bound for life. Remember how earlier we said that mutual consent was enough to form a valid marriage? Well, this is where things got truly chaotic. The church believed, and enforced, that a couple could be fully and officially married just by saying the right words to each other. No witnesses? Still valid. No priest? Also valid. No idea what just happened? Sorry, you're hitched. This kind of marriage was called verbum de praesenti, a spoken present tense vow. If you said, "I take you as my wife," and the other person said, "I take you as my husband," congratulations. You are now locked in a legally binding union that only death, or the Pope, can get you out of. You didn't even have to be sober, or fully aware, or, in some tragic cases, willing. This led to a ton of drama. Imagine two teens sneaking out to a meadow. They are flirting. They say the words because it feels romantic or rebellious. Maybe they're quoting from a love poem. Maybe they're trying to avoid an arranged marriage their parents are forcing on them. Well, joke's on them, because when the church found out, or if one of them tried to marry someone else later, those whispered vows counted. There are documented court cases where a woman produced witnesses claiming she and a man had privately exchanged promises years earlier, and the court annulled his new marriage on the spot. Want to make things even weirder? You didn't even have to say the vows directly. Some priests argued that if someone said, "I wish you were my wife," and the other person responded with anything remotely affirmative, that was enough to start a legal battle. And if the couple did have sex afterward, that sealed the deal. The church treated sex after mutual promise as conclusive proof of marriage. It was called marriage by copula. Even if no one saw the vows happen, if you slept together and there was even the suggestion that you'd spoken some kind of promise, boom, legal marriage. Cue a century of legal chaos. In one famous 14th century case, a man tried to marry a woman, but another woman stepped forward and claimed she'd had sex with him years earlier after exchanging marriage-like words. The court investigated, found her credible, and blocked the wedding. Just imagine the look on the bride's face. This wasn't some rare technicality. It happened so often that medieval church courts developed entire systems to deal with it. They questioned witnesses, analyzed the exact wording of private conversations, and tried to determine intent. Did he say will or would? Did she mean marry as a joke, or was she serious? Was it just a drunken tavern chat, or a binding sacrament? You might be wondering, why did the church go along with this? Wouldn't they want people to get married in churches with witnesses and blessings? Oh, absolutely. But here's the thing. The church also believed in the spiritual primacy of consent. Their logic was that if two souls chose each other freely and declared it sincerely, that was more sacred than any ceremony. So while they preferred formal weddings, they couldn't, and wouldn't, deny the power of a secret promise. Now imagine the social fallout. Two teenagers exchange vows and kiss behind a haystack. Years later, one tries to marry someone else. A lawsuit erupts. Both families are furious. Dowries are threatened. People are excommunicated. This was real. This happened. Repeatedly. And let's not forget the scams. Some people exploited this system, claiming they had secret marriages to manipulate inheritances or ruin reputations. Imagine a woman showing up at a man's deathbed claiming to be his true wife, entitled to his estate. If she had a few convincing witnesses, she might just win. Entire fortunes were redirected this way. In response, communities and churches began demanding more structure. That's when bans, public announcements of upcoming marriages, became a thing. 3 Sundays in a row, the priest would announce your engagement to the congregation. If anyone had objections or secret vows to reveal, now was the time. It was like medieval Facebook drama, but shouted in church. Eventually, by the 16th century, the Catholic Church finally tightened the rules under the Council of Trent. They declared that for a marriage to be valid, it had to be in front of a priest and witnesses. But that was centuries after countless lives had already been tied and tangled together by whispered promises, misunderstandings, and legal grey areas. So, to sum it up, in medieval Europe, saying "I do" wasn't always necessary. Saying "I might" while looking into someone's eyes during a May Day festival, that could ruin your life. And if you're thinking that at least the wedding feast might have been fun, hold that thought. Next, we'll explore what the reception actually looked like, and spoiler alert, it's less fairy tale, more fermented cabbage and crossbows. So, you've been married, whether by force, by accident, or by whispered vow under a tree, and now it's time to celebrate. That's right, the wedding feast. The reception. The medieval party of your nightmares. Let's just say up front, if you're imagining elegant gowns, twinkling lights, and a dainty string quartet, stop. This isn't a Jane Austen novel. This is more muddy yard, screaming livestock, questionable stew, and a juggler who might be drunk. First of all, wedding receptions in the Middle Ages varied wildly depending on your class. If you were rich, like noble rich, you could expect a multi-day banquet with dozens of dishes, performers, and maybe even a bear tied to a pole. If you were a peasant, you were lucky if someone brought beer and didn't vomit in the pig trough. Let's start with the nobles. A high-status wedding was a display of wealth and power more than love. Guests were expected to eat, and keep eating, to prove that the family could afford it. You'd see roast swans, spiced boar, towers of candied fruit, and possibly a pie with live birds inside, which was exactly as chaotic as it sounds. And the portions? Unholy. No forks yet, so you'd use knives and fingers. Meat juices dripping. Bread used as plates, called trenchers, that were either eaten afterward or handed to the poor, after being soaked in grease and drool. If you were lower class and somehow allowed in, you might be standing along the walls, praying someone dropped a chicken leg. As the meal went on, so did the entertainment. Musicians played lutes and flutes. Poets recited verses so long they could outlast a cow's digestive cycle. Acrobats flipped. Dwarfs juggled. Someone might dance with a goose. These were not sophisticated acts. They were chaotic medieval circus routines designed to distract people from the raw sewage smell outside. There was always someone trying to impress, Uncle so-and-so loudly showing off how much mead he could drink, cousins throwing knives into a tree, that one guy who insisted he could play the bagpipes with his nose. And somewhere in the corner, a minstrel singing a very suggestive ballad about a knight and a dairymaid. No one was ever sober. Ever. Now, weddings among peasants. Entirely different vibe. Shorter. Rougher. Far less food. You might have some coarse bread, onion soup, maybe a boiled chicken if you were lucky. Ale from a communal bucket. And a fiddler playing the same 4 notes over and over until someone tackled him. But peasants knew how to party with what little they had. These were people who lived hard lives. A wedding was a rare break. So even if all they had was porridge and a fiddle with 1 string, they made it count. There was dancing, wild dancing. The kind where people stomped their boots so hard it cracked floorboards. There were games, some of which involved wrestling, blindfolds, or hitting each other with sticks. And yes, even here, public bedding jokes were part of the evening's entertainment. Now let's talk about gifts. In the modern world, you might expect a toaster, a card, maybe a bit of cash. In the Middle Ages, if you were noble, guests might bring livestock, bolts of cloth, or bags of spice. Peasants gave what they could, firewood, a homemade comb, or even just help building your roof. Sometimes gifts were less charming. A father might give his daughter a servant, or a pig, or a relic of some saint he swore was magical, or a knife and a "may God help you" speech that was half sincere, half resignation. And remember, marriage wasn't just between 2 people. It was between families. So the reception could easily turn into a strategic show-off match. Who had the better land? Who gave the bigger dowry? Who could belch louder while maintaining eye contact with the priest? Petty rivalries ran deep. Fights broke out. Siblings stormed off. One uncle would bring up an inheritance dispute halfway through the meat course and ruin everything. In some towns, local customs shaped the whole thing. In parts of France, newlyweds were expected to parade through the village, sometimes sitting backward on a donkey, while children pelted them with flower petals, or dung. In Scotland, it was common to blacken the bride and groom before the wedding, covering them in soot, feathers, and molasses. Yes, before the ceremony. Because what's more romantic than being tarred and feathered by your friends? There were also post-wedding rituals. One involved the bride being undressed by her female relatives while the groom waited in bed, surrounded by drunk men toasting his virility. Another tradition, especially in Germanic areas, was the bride chase, where male guests tried to steal the bride and hide her somewhere. The groom then had to find her, usually by following a trail of increasingly lewd clues, and ransom her back with drinks. And just in case the day wasn't already traumatic enough, some communities had a special song, a mock lament, sung as the bride was handed over to the groom's family. It mourned her lost youth, freedom, and virginity. Kind of like a dirge, but with tambourines. When the food was gone, the ale spilled, and the fire burned low, people either stumbled home or collapsed where they stood. Children curled up in hay piles. Dogs gnawed on discarded bones. Someone snored next to a harp. And in the middle of it all, the newlyweds disappeared, either to be bedded, or to pretend they were while sneaking out the back for a nap. And thus ended your wedding day. What began as a political contract or an accidental vow ended with you lying beside a stranger, in a borrowed bed, still smelling of onions and sweat, while a distant relative played one last off-key tune on the bagpipes. But don't relax yet. Because next, we tackle what married life was actually like. Spoiler, there's less romance and more plowing, both literal and metaphorical. So you've survived the drunken toasts, the fish pie, the juggler with the twitchy eye, and your aunt's 3-hour sobbing speech about when she was young. You've been paraded, toasted, maybe blackened with soot and molasses, and now you're married. You know what that means. It's time to prove it. In the medieval world, consummation wasn't a private affair. It was a legal requirement. And it wasn't just about sealing the deal, it was about proving it to everyone who mattered. Because here's the horrifying truth, a wedding wasn't real until it had been physically, undeniably, biologically consummated. And people wanted evidence. Let's set the scene. In many places, after the feast, the entire wedding party would escort the newlyweds to bed. Not metaphorically. Physically. Carrying candles, singing bawdy songs, and throwing flower petals, or sometimes wheat, or even literal feathers. They'd march the couple into the bedchamber like they were presenting a new calf to a barn stall. Now, if you were noble, this moment was formal. There might be a priest to bless the bed, witnesses to see the undressing, and yes, maids, mothers, sisters, aunts, all gathered around the bride to peel off her layers like an onion while joking loudly about what was coming next. Meanwhile, the groom might get a slightly less graceful escort, his brothers and friends shoving him, jeering, and offering advice that mostly consisted of puns and gestures. In some places, the men even dragged the groom in naked, tossing him onto the mattress like a sack of flour. And then, everyone waited. Literally. Waited. Sometimes in the room, sometimes outside the door, but definitely listening. The hope was to hear, well, noises. Of some sort. Movement. Shifting. A scream, a giggle, something that confirmed the act had occurred. And this wasn't just tradition. It had legal implications. If the marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled later. No sex. No marriage. That's how serious they were about it. Some families even demanded evidence the next morning. And by evidence, we mean the bed sheets. These were carefully inspected for blood, which was assumed to signal the bride's virginity. If there was none, accusations could fly. Arguments could break out. Marriages could be challenged in court. A stain could make or break a woman's future. Of course, biology doesn't always cooperate. Many brides didn't bleed, for totally normal, medical reasons. But that didn't matter. Families expected proof, and if it wasn't there, things got ugly. Some women faked it, pricking their finger, hiding a vial of pig's blood, even injuring themselves on purpose. Anything to make sure the sheets looked right. Now, not everyone was doing this in front of a full audience. In some households, especially among peasants, it was a bit more private. But even then, someone was always watching the clock, or listening, or banging on the door every 10 minutes with crude encouragement. And if you didn't do it on the first night, gossip spread like wildfire. Was the bride too afraid? Was the groom too drunk? Was someone hiding something? People would invent elaborate rumors before breakfast. One infamous medieval tradition even involved bedding witnesses. People, usually older and nosier than they had any right to be, who would stand at the foot of the bed and, no joke, watch. Sometimes clapping. Sometimes offering commentary. It was like a sporting event, except with more awkward eye contact and slightly less nudity. And in some noble courts, especially in France and Italy, kings and lords took things even further. They held public bedding ceremonies in the Great Hall. The newlyweds would be stripped to their underclothes and led to a bed in full view of the court. A priest would say a prayer, the bed curtains would be drawn, and then everyone toasted the act before it even happened. Sometimes they didn't wait for privacy at all. Yes, you heard that right. People once clapped while watching someone get into bed. Medieval romance, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, all this was wrapped up in politics and property. Remember, marriages were contracts. They sealed alliances, merged lands, determined inheritance. So if the couple didn't seal the marriage physically, nothing counted. The bride could go back to her family. The dowry might have to be returned. And lawsuits could explode from it. The pressure, especially on women, was unbearable. Virginity wasn't just a cultural ideal, it was currency. A woman who wasn't untouched on her wedding night could lose her value entirely in the eyes of society. It didn't matter if she'd been in love before, or assaulted, or if the rumors weren't even true. The stain on her reputation could last a lifetime. Men, on the other hand, not so much. They were expected to be experienced. And if they failed to perform on the wedding night, well, they might be mocked, but rarely punished. Sometimes their buddies would help by offering unsolicited advice, or herbs, or threats, whatever made the job get done. And let's not pretend these were always happy unions. In many cases, the bride and groom barely knew each other. They might have been forced into the match. She might be terrified. He might be uninterested, or worse, aggressive. And yet, all eyes were on them to act out this ritual as if it were joyful and natural. It wasn't. Behind the laughter, the songs, and the rituals was a deep vein of control. Over bodies, over reputation, over women's futures. The public bedding wasn't about celebration. It was surveillance. Social enforcement disguised as tradition. But the next morning, no matter how awful the night had been, life resumed. The sheets were hung out for display. The guests slurped cold porridge and stumbled home. And the couple, exhausted, confused, maybe traumatized, were now husband and wife in the eyes of church, state, and every nosy cousin within 5 miles. Congratulations! You survived the wedding night. Too bad that was the easy part. Because now, you're stuck in a medieval marriage. Welcome to married life in the Middle Ages, a world where romance takes a backseat to duty, survival, and a whole lot of work. If you think getting hitched was rough, wait till you find out what comes next. First off, forget privacy. Once you say, "I do," your life is pretty much public property. Houses were cramped, walls were thin, made of mud and wattle, remember, and rooms were shared, not just with your spouse, but often with kids, servants, and the occasional farm animal. So don't expect candlelit dinners or whispered sweet nothings. It's more like snoring, coughing, and the occasional screech of a pig. Speaking of kids, producing heirs was the #1 job of any medieval marriage. Not love, not companionship, but babies. Lots of babies. Ideally, sons to carry on the family name and inherit property. And the pressure. Crushing. Women were expected to conceive quickly, often within weeks, and to keep having children until menopause or death. Pregnancy wasn't glamorous. It was dangerous. And childbirth was a leading cause of death for women. No epidurals. No prenatal care. Just grit, prayer, and hope you lived through it. Meanwhile, men had to maintain the household, manage land or trade, and defend their property, sometimes literally, with pitchforks and swords. If the wife's dowry included land, he was now in charge. She might have been given the property, but the husband controlled it. And forget about equal say. Medieval marriage was almost always hierarchical. The husband was head of the household, the law, and pretty much everything else. The wife's role was to obey, bear children, manage the servants, and keep the home running. Disobedience could mean physical punishment or being sent away. Also, love? Not required. Affection? Optional. In fact, most marriages were arranged for political or economic reasons. Love was a luxury. Some couples got lucky, sure. Others hated each other from day one. And here's the kicker. Divorce was practically impossible. The church frowned upon it. Annulments were rare, costly, and required complex legal proof, like non-consummation or consanguinity. So if you were stuck with a terrible spouse, you were mostly stuck. That said, some medieval women found subtle ways to push back. They managed the household budget, maintained relationships with extended family, and sometimes secretly influenced local politics. A clever wife could wield power behind the scenes. But outright rebellion? Dangerous. And let's talk about sex. It was mandatory for procreation but often devoid of passion. Religious teachings painted sex as a necessary evil, good for babies, bad for pleasure. So couples were encouraged to keep it quick, practical, and only when needed. On the bright side, there were traditions that allowed for some humor and levity. Medieval love poems, songs, and jokes celebrated flirtation, desire, and even infidelity. Because let's face it, people still craved connection, even in a system that didn't prioritize it. But infidelity came with huge risks, especially for women. Caught cheating? You could face public humiliation, violence, or worse. Men's affairs were often ignored or tolerated. Women's weren't. And don't forget household chores. The wife was responsible for cooking over a smoky fire, fetching water, spinning wool, and cleaning, not to mention raising kids and managing servants or farmhands. The husband might oversee fields or trades, but she kept the engine running. In short, medieval marriage was a complex mix of power, duty, survival, and social expectation, far from the romantic ideal we often imagine. Next up, what happened if the marriage went bad? Because trust me, it wasn't pretty. Now, what if you married someone and it all went sideways? Spoiler alert, medieval divorce wasn't let's chat and split the Netflix account. It was complicated, expensive, and often humiliating for everyone involved. For starters, legal divorce was nearly impossible. The church controlled marriage laws, and it considered marriage a sacred, lifelong bond. Breaking it wasn't taken lightly. The only real option was annulment, declaring the marriage null from the start, as if it never happened. But annulments required solid reasons: non-consummation, consanguinity, marrying a close relative, or fraud. Non-consummation? Remember that public bedding? If you never had sex, you might get an annulment. But proving that was tricky. Consanguinity? Medieval aristocrats found out the hard way when their family trees got tangled, and cousins ended up married. Fraud? If one party was forced or lied to, annulment might be granted. Even then, the process was costly and required the Pope's permission in many cases, which could take years. Meanwhile, you were still stuck living with your ex in most cases. Separation without annulment was more common. Couples would sometimes agree to live apart, sometimes in different villages or households, but remained legally married. This often happened when the wife was abused, or the couple was incompatible. But this was socially frowned upon, and women especially faced pressure to reconcile. And let's not sugarcoat it, women faced the brunt of the blame and punishment in marriage disputes. If a wife tried to leave, she risked losing her dowry, custody of children, and social standing. Men had far more freedom to remarry or take mistresses. Women? Not so much. In some cases, abusive husbands were restrained by local laws, but enforcement was spotty at best. Many women endured violence silently because they had no legal recourse or support network. Leaving a husband meant poverty and shame. On the flip side, some noblewomen wielded surprising power. Widows with estates could manage property independently, and occasionally, powerful queens or ladies influenced politics and even brokered peace deals. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Church courts often got involved in marital disputes, but their solutions favored preserving the marriage rather than dissolving it. Punishments included fines, penance, or ordering reconciliation. Interestingly, adultery trials were a big source of drama and public spectacle. Women accused of cheating could face public shaming, whipping, or worse. Men, usually forgiven or ignored. All this meant that marriage was a trap for many, especially women. A contract not just of love or alliance, but of control, property, and lifelong obligations, often enforced by threats, violence, and the fear of social exile. But don't lose hope just yet. Some couples found ways to make it work, through companionship, mutual respect, or simple survival instincts. Sometimes, they even fell in love. Next, we'll look at the colorful, chaotic, and occasionally charming world of medieval wedding guests and their own weird rituals. Because trust me, the couple wasn't the only source of madness. Weddings weren't just about the couple, they were community events, packed with relatives, neighbors, frenemies, and a surprising number of gatecrashers. And trust me, these guests didn't just sit quietly sipping mead, they brought their own brand of chaos. First off, expect drunkenness. Lots of it. Mead, ale, and wine flowed like rivers, and most guests treated the feast as an all-you-can-drink buffet with a side of public humiliation. Uncle Bert might start a loud argument about whose sheep are better, Cousin Marjorie might try to steal the bride's shoes, and a group of young men could launch a full-scale food fight. All before the wedding night. In fact, medieval weddings sometimes ended with fights so intense that towns had to send in the constables, or in rural areas, the local lords armed men, to break them up. The phrase raising Cain might as well have been invented here. And it wasn't just random brawls. There were weird traditions designed to humiliate or test the newlyweds, and often their guests. For example, in parts of England and Scotland, guests would kidnap the bride, hiding her somewhere and demanding ransom in food, drink, or coin before releasing her. The groom then had to hunt her down, usually while drunk and wearing a ridiculous hat. Another tradition involved the log sawing ritual, where the bride and groom had to saw through a log together using a shared saw. It symbolized teamwork but also made for hilarious and awkward moments, especially if the couple didn't know each other well. Imagine trying to cut wood while everyone's yelling and someone's trying to steal the saw. Food could be an invitation for more chaos too. In some regions, there was a tradition called cake pulling, where two guests on either side of the bride and groom each pulled on a piece of wedding cake, and whoever got the larger piece was considered luckier. The problem? Sometimes people got into fistfights over it. Then there was the infamous clouty or cloth-tossing custom, where guests would throw cloth or scraps of fabric onto the couple to wish them prosperity. This sounds sweet until you realize guests sometimes brought dirty laundry or scraps from ripped clothes. Imagine getting smothered in medieval gym socks. Don't forget about the children. Kids were often invited to the feast, and they got the best of the chaos. Running under tables, stealing food, and sometimes setting small fires with leftover candles. Not exactly a quiet family gathering. And speaking of fires, weddings were also prime time for accidents. Wooden halls, open hearths, and drunken guests made for a dangerous mix. There are records of entire wedding feasts ending prematurely due to a barn catching fire, or a drunken relative knocking over a torch. Talk about a party spoiler. On a more sinister note, weddings were sometimes targeted by rival families or thieves. With so much food, drink, and gifts gathered in one place, a well-timed raid could be disastrous. Townsfolk kept an eye out, but you can imagine how effective a drunken mob was at deterring bandits. Now, you're probably wondering about the role of music and dancing. Yes, there was music, but it was often less romantic ballad and more everyone shouting to be heard over the bagpipes. Dancing was energetic, involving stomping, spinning, and occasionally falling over. This could end in bruises or broken limbs, but hey, that's how they rolled. There were also plenty of wedding songs, some sweet, some bawdy, some downright offensive. Many songs poked fun at the bride's innocence, the groom's virility, or the mother-in-law's greed. The medieval version of a roast. And finally, weddings were a prime moment for gossip to explode. Who flirted with whom? Who got rejected? Who was too drunk to walk? Stories from weddings spread faster than a wildfire, often growing more exaggerated with each retelling. So, a medieval wedding wasn't just a ceremony, it was a full-blown, chaotic, raucous community spectacle with all the drama, comedy, and disaster you'd expect. But wait, there's more. We still need to dive into the darker side, the risks, diseases, and outright disasters lurking behind the feast tables and wedding dances. Next section coming up. Alright, so we've danced, drunk, and fought our way through the feast. But here's the nasty truth nobody wants to say. Medieval weddings were disease hotspots, breeding grounds for illness, infection, and sometimes death. Remember, this is the Middle Ages. No hand sanitizer. No antibiotics. No understanding that sharing a cup could spread plague. Guests packed into cramped halls, sweating, shouting, coughing, and passing around reused plates and goblets. The perfect recipe for disaster. Common illnesses like the flu, dysentery, or worse could spread like wildfire. A wedding might start with a lively crowd and end with half the guests bedridden or worse. And if a guest showed signs of the plague, well, that was a death sentence for many. There were no quarantine rules, no health checks, Just the hope that the ale killed some germs, which it didn't. And then there's the food. Medieval hygiene was questionable. Meat might be weeks old, kept in cellars with rats and mice. Food was often overcooked to mask the smell but still could harbor bacteria. The wedding stew? You might call it medieval mystery meat. Eating it was a gamble. Guests sometimes got food poisoning, or worse, parasites. Worms were common in the medieval gut, and a wedding feast was like a worm-themed amusement park. Alcohol was often safer than water, so guests drank heavily. This led to sloppy eating, fights, and accidents, but it also helped dull the pain of the poor quality fare. Weddings could also turn deadly due to accidental injuries. Open flames and wooden beams meant fires were a constant hazard. Drunken brawls could lead to broken bones or even fatal wounds. There are records of wedding guests dying from falls, stabbings, or even being trampled by panicked animals. And don't forget the newlyweds themselves. The bride's first pregnancy was fraught with danger. Complications were common and could kill her or the baby. Childbirth was a leading cause of death for women of all classes. If the bride died shortly after marriage, the husband might marry again quickly, because, remember, heirs were the point. But if the groom died, the widow's fate depended on family politics. Some were remarried off immediately, others pushed into convents. Finally, weddings were expensive, and sometimes people borrowed money or went into debt to host them. This financial stress could cripple families, especially peasants, for years. Weddings could mean feasts, gifts, new clothes, and sometimes fines or taxes. If a family couldn't pay, they faced ruin. So, weddings were a risky gamble, socially, financially, and physically. But you might be wondering, after all this, why bother? Why did people go through these brutal rituals and dangerous parties? What made medieval weddings worth it? Next up, we dive into the powerful social and political reasons behind medieval weddings, and why, despite all the misery, people still clung to these traditions. After everything we've covered, the awkward vows, the chaotic feasts, the exhausting wedding night, and all the dangers lurking in the shadows, you might wonder, why did medieval people put themselves through this madness? What made weddings so incredibly important that they risked sickness, scandal, and a lifetime of control? The answer: power, property, and politics. In medieval society, marriage wasn't about two people falling in love and living happily ever after. It was a transaction, a strategic alliance designed to secure land, wealth, and influence. Love was a luxury, something that sometimes happened, but wasn't necessary. Imagine your family owns a patch of land. You want to keep it safe from rival neighbors or expand it. You marry your daughter to a powerful lord. Boom, two properties combine, two armies align, and your family's status skyrockets. The marriage seals the deal. Dowries and bride prices were major parts of this. The bride's family often paid a hefty dowry, a sum of money, goods, or land, to the groom's family. This was like a medieval investment. Sometimes it was so large it could bankrupt a family. In return, the groom promised to support and protect the bride, and, of course, produce heirs. And here's a fun medieval twist: sometimes dowries never made it to the bride. The husband controlled them. He could use them, sell them, or lose them gambling. The bride had little say. If you were noble or royal, your marriage was also a political statement. It was about peace treaties, alliances between kingdoms, and securing loyalties. Kings and queens often married off their children like pieces on a chessboard, moving them where power demanded. On a local level, marriages could end feuds or spark new ones. If two families hated each other, marrying their heirs might make peace, or lead to bloodier revenge if the union went sour. Even common folk weren't immune. Peasant marriages often reinforced community ties and social hierarchies. Marrying into a respected family could boost your status. Marrying poorly could doom you to a lifetime of hardship. So weddings were high-stakes deals. Everything, the ceremony, the feast, the bedding, the public display, was part of showing off strength, wealth, and commitment. That's why these events were so elaborate and chaotic. Everyone wanted to see the power play unfold, to judge who had the upper hand. But here's the kicker: despite all the control, the politics, and the misery, weddings also created real, lasting bonds. Sometimes couples found genuine affection. Sometimes communities came together. Sometimes a party, even a disaster, created memories people cherished. In a way, the medieval wedding was like a medieval reality show, full of drama, power struggles, surprises, and yes, even a bit of humor. So next time you think about medieval weddings, don't picture delicate flowers and gentle music. Think of it as a battlefield with costumes, drunk uncles, and stakes high enough to shape history. Now, in our final section, we'll slow things down, reflect on the madness, and send you off with a soothing close. Because after all that, you've earned it. Alright, we've unraveled the tangled, wild, and downright awful truth behind medieval weddings. Before we close the chapter on this chaotic journey, let's take a moment to slow down and breathe. Picture this, a quiet medieval evening, long after the feasting is done, the guests have stumbled home, and the great hall sits empty. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of hay and wood smoke. Outside, the night hums softly with the rustling of leaves and distant owl calls. You, the newlywed, lie awake in the dim candlelight, heart pounding from the day's madness. It's over. The shouting, the drinking, the fights, the prying eyes. The world feels still, vast, and maybe a little bit lonely. Despite the hardships, the rules, the power plays, there's something profoundly human in that quiet moment. Two people, thrown together by forces bigger than themselves, trying to find a fragile connection in a world that rarely gave them much choice. Think of the hundreds, thousands of couples across medieval Europe, some forced, some accidental, some surprisingly hopeful, starting their lives amid dust, noise, and uncertainty. They faced fear, pain, and social scrutiny, yet carried on. They survived and sometimes, even thrived. Medieval weddings were messy, absurd, and often brutal, but they were also beginnings. A dance of hope wrapped in tradition and turmoil. So, as you settle in tonight, remember, history isn't just dates and dry facts. It's people living, loving, struggling, just like us. And sometimes, knowing how hard it was back then makes our own stories a little sweeter. Thanks for sticking with me on this journey through time's most chaotic I do. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval madness, don't forget to like and subscribe. And hey, drop your location and local time below. I love seeing where you're all tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and drift off knowing you probably wouldn't survive a medieval wedding day, but at least you don't have to. Sweet dreams.